Welcome, everyone. We're giving folks a few minutes to join in. We are also having some technical difficulties today. So we are trying to get our professional captioning up and running. So you may see some glitches with captioning while we're doing that. Our goal today is to have ASL interpreting, voiced presentations, and professional captioning. We are so glad so many of you are here today. Give us just a minute and we will get started because we have a lot of wonderful information to share with you today. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Michelle Niehaus. I'm the program administrator for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services with the Kentucky Department for Behavioral Health, Developmental, and Intellectual Disabilities. We have communication access happening a few different ways today. We have our interpreters, Julie Buckham and Shannon Greider, and we will hopefully be offering our professional captioning on the Show Captions button with Tracy Lundegren. Today, you are in for a treat. We have two experts in deaf and hard of hearing services and in forensic work. The department has been working very closely with the Administrative Office of the Courts and with the Judicial Commission on Mental Health. And today we are really going to focus on services for people with serious mental illness and hearing loss. We have with us today Dr. Deb Guthman. She's a national consultant who's worked within the deaf community for over 40 years in substance use, mental health, education, medical, and legal settings. She served as an expert witness and is one of the editors and a contributor for a book published by Gallaudet Press entitled Deaf People in the Criminal Justice System, Selected Topics on Advocacy, Incarceration, and Social Justice. She also serves as an advisor for a documentary film called Being Michelle, which focuses on the injustices that happened to a deaf and disabled woman while incarcerated. Dr. Guthman is a well-known and well-respected expert in the field and a mentor to many, including me, and I'm grateful for her time here today. Dr. Gabe Lomas is a professor and director of counseling programs at Gallaudet University. Formerly, Dr. Lomas taught at Western Connecticut State University, where he developed the Connecticut Center for School Safety and Crisis Preparation. Both as a professor and clinician, he's worked in the field of crisis preparation, response, and recovery for over 20 years. Dr. Lomas has published widely on topics related to assessment, forensics, deaf and hard of hearing services, and crisis preparation. Dr. Lomas is also a well-respected colleague, and I am so glad to have him here today. I believe, Dr. Guthman, that you're going to get us started.
Yes. Thank you so much, Michelle. And Dr. Lomas will be sharing the screen with the PowerPoint. And while he's getting that set up, I have to do a shout out to Michelle because not only does she consider me a mentor, the respect is likewise. We've worked together on many projects, and I really cherish her commitment to this population and some of the wonderful work that she's done over the years in Kentucky in getting more services available related to substance use services. And now I'm very excited to see the focus on the court system and the forensic area. Now I see the interpreter. I don't see Gabe, and maybe we can pop him up too. There he is. Great. Today, what we hope to do is present a lot of information. And Michelle knows from working with me, and I know from working with Gabe, we don't always have an opportunity to share with people such as yourself some of this really important information. And so we tend to over-prepare a lot. So we're hoping that the information today will be useful for you and will help as you work with this low incidence population with high need. So we're going to go through everything from what happens when deaf individuals are at risk and in school settings, moving on into different kinds of interactions with law enforcement, and then what happens in the prison system. We're going to do some case studies, we're going to do some videos, and we'll kind of explain along the way some of the different work that we're going to do. As Michelle said, Gabe and I were involved writing a book together. It's one of the only books out there that really focuses on this topic. And we each come to really this focus in different ways. When I was involved with teaching and then counseling and substance use, I would interact with individuals who were involved with law enforcement and ended up in prison settings, either as juveniles or adults. And the services and access was very limited, and the treatment was definitely not equal to what hearing people encountered. And so that really started the interest for me to shift focus into this area. And the book was a natural way to do that. And then the work that Gabe and I have continued to do. And we hope you can share some of your experiences with us. We welcome through Q&A questions throughout the process. As we move forward, we'll try and catch those as we go. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gabe. Oh, Gabe, slide one forward first before I switch it. This was a drawing that someone that I had worked with had made, and I think it's just kind of a positive picture because it brings together blind individuals and deaf individuals. And you can see that this person said kindness is a language, and that the blind can see and the deaf can hear. So you can see that they've placed ears over the eyes and eyes over the ears. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and continue. Gabe.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gabe Lomas, and I wanted to start off just with a quick apology. I have quite a setup here at my home office where I've got a really nice big screen up here on the wall, and my camera is down here. So it looks like I'm looking off into space, but I am actually looking at the screen. I'm looking at you, so I apologize for the way it may look. So Deb actually did a really nice job, kind of getting us started. I think you have received the objectives already. So let's just get going with the presentation. Oops. So and she also shared, I think Michelle shared with you guys that Deb and I were contributors. We were the co-editors on this book, Deaf People in the Justice System. So we're going to start out with, what does it mean to be deaf? I think it's kind of fascinating because this is one of the areas where we've got such disparity. Most deaf children are born to parents who are hearing, and so that you've got this disconnect a lot of times with communication. So we estimate in the US, we've got about 500,000 people who use American Sign Language, 11 million deaf people, an additional 48 million with some level of hearing loss. So we can see that also represented in the prison system where we've got, certain statistics that are really hard to get, and we'll address that later. But when you talk about people with hearing loss, that is a pretty wide group of people. When you talk about people who use ASL, that's a pretty small group of people with about 500,000. And then they really have diverse modes of communication. Deaf people, we should ask them, what do they prefer? You can see by these images here, you've got sign language, hearing aids, cochlear implants. Those are really common supports that deaf people will often use for communication. But not just, it's important to note that not every deaf person is going to use sign language. Not every deaf person also is able to lip read. It's pretty challenging to do lip reading. So understanding that every deaf person is different, and sometimes even as they grow up, they may change their modality, what's most comfortable for them. So this slide here kind of focuses on that what I was just saying, that not all deaf people identify with deaf culture. So you may have deaf people who maybe are late deafened, and they don't really, they're able to communicate effectively in spoken language and use another sort of assistive device or something like that to communicate. And so they don't really identify with deaf culture. And identity is highly personal and it's constantly evolving. It's sometimes contextual too. Like in one context, they may feel comfortable, and they can also feel comfortable in a different context. So I mentioned this already that at least 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents, and there's a wide range of hearing loss that has different effects on ability to process sound and understand. So just as a quick example, you may have meet a deaf person who lost their hearing, at age 1, and another deaf person who lost their hearing at age 3. So the child who lost their hearing at age 3, they've been exposed to auditory information, and so they may have good speech and hearing. They may still rely on sign language, though, So, but compared to the person who lost their hearing at age 1, that they're all going to be processing it differently. They'll have very varying abilities to produce speech. And you'll see that today in a video that Deb has, where there is a woman who is going to she produces speech, but is it understandable? Is it intelligible? And then, of course, lip reading. I think that's also a common misnomer, that deaf people can lip read. Lip reading abilities vary considerably, but if you were to take the sound and turn it off and just try to read someone's lips, you would see that it's a very imperfect, method, that it's very difficult, that even the most skilled people can get about 25 to 30% of communication just by lip reading. And so it's really not an effective way. And certainly when we think about the justice system, it's not an effective accommodation. So this is some of the terminology in our field. We do say that a person is deaf, deaf-blind, late deafened, or hard of hearing. I think I've already used just about all those terms in the first couple of minutes of our presentation. We do not say deaf and dumb, deaf mute, or hearing impaired. Sometimes you'll see the words hearing impaired on some official language, but the population, deaf people as a whole, in general, prefer to use the terms on the left side of the slide. Deaf people often communicate using video relay services. They communicate with VRS quite a bit when they try to reach out to hearing people. So this is a multi-step process, but years ago we used to have technology that wasn't like this. So let's just quickly look through the steps, okay? The deaf person will reach out to the video relay service and they use an interpreter. The interpreter speaks to the hearing person, then the hearing person will speak to the interpreter, and the interpreter signs to the deaf person. So that's the cycle that we have here. In reality, it is immediate. It is real fast. So like when you have a conversation, sometimes like when you pause for a breath, the interpreter will interrupt you just like the way you would in a hearing conversation. And so there's really almost no delay, no lag. It's very natural and very quick. And it's important to think about video relay because this is really the standard today, how deaf people communicate when they're using telecommunications. And we think about, do they have access to this when they're in the carceral system? When they're in local, state, and federal prisons, do they have access to this? We do have the answer to that question later on. Another, major component really is the CDI, the Certified Deaf Interpreter. And that's a person who's deaf and who's been certified by the RID, the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, and certified to interpret. The CDI has specialized training and they're experienced in using gesture, mime, props, drawing, other tools to enhance their communication. They have a deep knowledge and understanding deafness, the deaf community, and deaf culture. And with their excellent communication skills, they bring this expertise into difficult situations. A CDI can work solo or they can work with a certified interpreter who's hearing. And in some situations, that combination CDI and hearing interpreter can help the communication to be more effective than just a hearing interpreter alone. A hearing interpreter interprets into ASL, and then the CDI interprets the ASL message into a visual mode. So I'm just going to give you a quick example. Sometimes deaf people who commit crimes or who are charged with crimes, don't fully understand, they may have language or cognitive delays, and they're not understanding the communication that's being offered to them. And certainly the language of court is pretty complicated. So a CDI, a certified deaf interpreter, is a deaf person may who may modify the language so the deaf person understands. And then the language of the deaf person might be signing or role playing, and then the CDI is processing that, then they put it into sign language, and then the hearing interpreter will voice what the CDI is saying. So it is a little bit of a multi-step process, but there is, just like you see interpreters here in this meeting today, there's a very professional feel to it when you've got these people who are highly trained. And before I go to the next slide, I just want to underscore this is a critical piece. If a deaf person doesn't understand what's going on in court, are they really getting justice? Are they able to participate in their own defense? And so considerations of a CDI it's really critical for the process. Okay, now uh, everybody in our field, for the most part, when you work in deaf and hard of hearing, we are familiar with this term. It's become a very popular term, language deprivation. Years ago, what we thought was language deprivation. Before we had the term language deprivation, we used to call this the lower functioning deaf or multi-handicap deaf, sometimes deaf disabled. That seems to be taking root, but really at the core, what's happening a lot is that when deaf kids are being identified in their youth, sometimes providers are not recommending sign language, and so the deaf child may grow up with speech and language supports, but they're not really learning them because they can't hear, what's happening. And so ultimately, what's happening to them is that they're being deprived of exposure to language. And so language deprivation really hurts their ability to function as they grow. The longer a person is deprived of language, the more challenging it is for them to function as an adult. And that is definitely a contributor to some of the challenges with the justice system. But if you think about it, if a person really can't communicate, they often will have difficulty connecting, attaching to their caregiver. And really, we want, a mother-child, parent-child to connect to each other, to develop a strong psychological attachment. There's been a lot of research on attachment. So if you have a mental health background, you're probably familiar with that terminology, that attachment is really key to a healthy psychological adjustment for all people. Deaf people sometimes with language deprivation just have limited use of language. Sometimes they catch up a little bit with sign language, but then they struggle a lot with written English. Up to half of all deaf children have language and learning challenges. So researchers will tell you that estimates show that between 45 and 55% of all deaf people have a disability that's secondary to deafness. And so there are some deaf people who have their only challenge really is hearing, but about half of deaf people have a disability, maybe a syndrome or something like that that causes challenges. And when you think about that disability, you think, how does that affect their ability to function in the legal system? How does that affect their understanding of laws? So that's a big piece, in my opinion. They also may not respond well to traditional training and deaf education interventions. And so we think about deaf kids go to schools just like hearing kids do. Years ago, probably 30 years ago and beyond, deaf kids went to these schools for the deaf, which are essentially like magnet schools. Like if you have a deaf child, they would go to the school for the deaf. If it was in your town, they may be a day student, but a lot of kids slept in the dorms and they stayed there for longer periods of time. But over time, since Public Law 94-142, we've seen this growth of deaf education that has worked its way into public schools. And what happens there, though, is that usually you have very traditional models of like we're taking our current curriculum and we're putting it into sign language. But just putting the curriculum into sign language doesn't really help deaf kids oftentimes with language deprivation because a lot of the curriculum is just going to go over their heads. They really need to have modified language and language richer environments. I don't That could be a presentation in and of itself. So I'm just going to move on, from here. We think about the providers that are out there. Specialized providers like Deb and I are really hard to find. But then even within our own community, finding people who have the specialization of working with those with language deprivation, that's like another level. That's even more challenging. I already mentioned that public schooling, it's predominant. That's become the norm now, but it's often not helpful for that population of kids who have language deprivation. And then what happens if a person can't communicate, oftentimes they show you how they feel and what they want using behavior. And those behaviors end up looking like they're resistant, like they're fighting back with the people who are trying to manage them. And so they end up, if they end up in the psychiatric, system, then they're moved out of schools into a psychiatric program and they require higher levels of care. And those higher levels of care are oftentimes still ineffective for them. The higher level of care pushes kids into what we would call a school to prison pipeline because it exposes them to more aggressive climates. A quick example, if you guys have never been into a psych hospital, and I have many times working with clients, sometimes, I mean, at all costs, we want to try to like avoid a psych hospital for somebody who's really not that serious. Sometimes what will happen is somebody who's maybe not that serious, but they need the hospitalization, they'll go in and they'll be exposed to people who are very serious and who will teach them things that you really don't want them to know, things about self-harm and homicide and other behaviors that we really don't want our client to be exposed to. And so putting them into those higher levels of care can often, cause more problems for them. Now, when we think about the prison population, those who are deaf and hard of hearing, there's really a significant, lack of information. Although there has been improvement over the years, Deb and I have always like try to stay on top of this issue. And I've seen over the past 5 or 6 years that some laws and some policies have been changing where we are seeing a little more information now about the demographics of inmates, and we are noticing that they are sometimes reporting disabilities, disability status, and deaf and hard of hearing. And crimes, it's important to know that crimes that occur in the deaf and hard of hearing population are pretty much the same that happen in the general population. So deaf people aren't more prone to commit a crime just because they're deaf. They may get in more trouble, and that's really another issue that we'll be talking about later on today. And then once deaf and hard of hearing people are in the justice system, they really appear to be at risk of staying longer or leaving without the treatments that they're entitled to. And that's really often due to lack of ADA access. A deaf person, for example, may want to be into a treatment group where they can learn some new skills, but oftentimes they'll say, well, we don't have an interpreter for that, or we will not provide the interpreter for that. And so the deaf person looks non-compliant and they are not able to get out at the same, pace that hearing people are able to get released. And now, if you think about our justice system or the prison system, it's really not unified. We have a federal system that has similar standards, but then every state has its own state system with its own standards and expectations. And then most towns have a town jail, and most counties have a county jail. Then there are also private prisons in our country for different purposes. And then there's detention centers. None of those are really unified. And so having standards that says they should all be the same and all kinds of intake data should be collected, that's not happening. So that results in the deaf experience also being very inconsistent. And so the only thing that is consistent really is the lack of access. When Deb and I interview deaf people who have been in prison before, the lack of access is really one of those universal themes. Now, Prison Policy Initiative, just from a report last year, they estimate over 1.9 million prisoners in state and federal prisons. So that's 583 per 100,000 residents. And people with disabilities represent 12% of the general population. And people with hearing loss are about 1% of that population. So that's one sort of ballpark estimate that there perhaps maybe about 23,000 deaf prisoners in our country. But you'll see here that these figures that I just showed you can be they're they this is kind of the way that we expect it to be, but the reality is sadly much worse. We'll get to that in a few slides. Okay, so disability and incarceration, the survey of inmates in 2016. There was a survey done by the Department of Justice that I'm sorry, I think that was this one. That's the Department of Justice Statistics Bureau that shows that they asked these questions like, are you deaf or do you have a serious difficulty hearing? They asked about vision, cognition, ambulatory, ADHD, special ed learning disability, and the results showed from this survey that um,
Gabe,
go ahead.
before you go on, back to that other slide, one of the issues just to point out is the way that that question is worded is how a lot of the national data is collected. So it asks if you're deaf or have serious difficulty hearing, but it doesn't give us the information as to people who are sign language users, which would be more helpful in terms of a breakdown, because serious difficulty hearing really could mean anything. It could be someone who is elderly, who wears hearing aids, or it could be someone who identifies as hard of hearing. So there is some work trying to get this to be more clear on some of the national data sets, but I did just want to throw that out. Sorry, Gabe.
No, that's great. That's fine. And we're partners here, so jump right in. I did see a hand go up, so I'm going to call on that person as soon as this slide I get done with this slide. This I find fascinating. Now, this is almost 10 years old. I would hope that the prison system would do this like every 5 years or so, but they did. They sent out a survey, and really what they found is people who self-identify as having any kind of disability. That was tw 2 in 5 inmates, or 38% of the federal prison system. Now, I want to pause right there because to me that's profound. Like we have estimates show from from school systems that 12 to really on the high end maybe 15% of all the student body has a disability. And yet the government's own study is showing that they have 38%. And the other studies show higher numbers, maybe upwards of nearly 50% of all prisoners have identified disabilities. And so the fact that we this kind of leads me to two conclusions. One is either people with disabilities are more prone to commit crimes, or two, we are locking up people with disabilities at rates that don't really make a lot of sense. Now, I would sort of agree with the latter conclusion and not the former conclusion. Um, is there a way for us to check that the Q&A? You're on mute, Deb.
Oops. There doesn't seem to be any questions currently. There was a reminder to use Q&A versus chat.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go on then. Okay, so we talked about some of these points already, and you'll see me kind of moving quickly. I do want you guys to feel comfortable interrupting as we go along, but Dr. Guthman and I have quite a bit of content, so I am gonna keep going. Okay, so disabilities by U.S. prisoners. This is the same study. A quarter of all prisoners reported special education. I mean, that's still kind of baffling to me. Most reported a cognitive disability, followed by ambulatory disability, and then vision. About 38%. So we're about 2.5 times more likely to report a disability than adults in the general population. So I'm just these slides are just underscoring what I mentioned before. So this talks about this one focuses on law enforcement culture and deaf culture, just kind of comparing the two. So we think about that police tend to use verbal and audio alerting, to get someone's attention, whereas deaf people use visual and tactile alerting. So, for example, if a police officer wants to speak with you, they will often raise their voice, and try to get your attention. So they may say, "Police, stop," but they're not using, visual alerts. But deaf people are used to visual alerts, and so there's a mismatch there. Police can also hear when it's dark. In other words, like police are hearing like you and I are. And so when the lights are off, we can still communicate. Deaf people really need the light to be able to communicate, using their eyes. Police will call out to get attention, but deaf people will either tap someone's shoulder They will often go into a room and flash the lights a couple of times. That gets everyone in the room to look over and say, "Why are the lights being flashed?" And that's how they get attention. Or sometimes they might stomp on the floor. In a building with wood flooring, it's very likely that if you stomp on the floor, someone across the room is going to feel that vibration and say, "What's going on?" And they'll turn around and it's an effective way to get attention. Police use tone of voice to convey emotion. And deaf people do not. They convey emotion through facial expression and body language. Police don't need to make eye contact to communicate. In fact, oftentimes if they're taking notes, they're looking down, as they're taking notes, but they're still communicating with you. But deaf people really need the eye contact to have effective communication. And then police can communicate for themselves directly, whereas deaf people, if they're working with other deaf people, they can communicate directly. But if they're working with law enforcement or anybody in the justice system, they will need an interpreter typically or another accommodation so that they can communicate effectively. Oh, this is yours, Dr. Guthman.
A couple things we wanted to point out the different law enforcement offices, police departments are doing, and I do have some examples from Kentucky as well, is this. So there's visor cards, there's wallet cards, there's a lot of pictorial kinds of indicators so that you could point, for instance, if you were stopping someone, why you're being stopped. You can see a picture of a speed limit. You can see that they missed a stop sign. Maybe they didn't have their seatbelt on. So these would be visor cards that could be used. And these examples are from Rochester, New York. They have a very large deaf population. They have one of the federally funded programs post-secondary there. And so they've done quite a bit in their community to be proactive in terms of law enforcement. There's options on this one for how they prefer to communicate, and also how to help me understand you better and what to do when pulled over. So there's a number of different tips here on these communication visor cards. Next slide. And here's a couple other examples from some other states as well. This is Ohio. You can see there's some similarities and some differences. This was developed by the Community Centers for the Deaf and is used throughout Ohio. And again, there's a difference for I am deaf, I am hard of hearing, differences for communicating, some tips, and some different versions of pictures, but similar concept. Next slide. And here are examples from Oregon, New York, and Illinois. So again, variations of these cards are used, and usually you can go online and download numerous examples and variations. So again, similar theme, just different icons or pictures used. And then the next one I think is Kentucky. Yes. And Kentucky is really proactive because there are 3 different versions for a person who uses American Sign Language or identifies as being deaf, a person who considers themselves oral, so speaks and is not able to use sign language or chooses not to, and then a person who is hard of hearing. And you can see on the bottom, it talks about the 3 different cards offered, as well as visor communication and an in case of emergency card and a communication card. I put the link down below as well, so that if you aren't aware that Kentucky offers this, you can access the information. And I'm sure Michelle or others involved with this training can help you if you didn't know these exist. But it's great that Kentucky is one of the ones that already has something set up. Next slide. Another example, this was just something that a person developed themselves and posted, that on their seatbelt strap, it says, deaf, in case of an emergency, ASL interpreter is needed. So different people have taken it upon themselves to come up with systems to help. And they call this a pullover pal, and people are actually able to purchase it. Next slide. Now in Illinois, what they do to be a bit more discreet, a deaf individual can choose to use the J88 designation. And law enforcement knows that if a person has J88 on their driver's license, they are identifying themselves as being a deaf individual. Because there are cases where officers stop a person and maybe they aren't actually deaf or hard of hearing, and they might be trying to use that as a way to get out of some kind of infraction. So this is a way that the police officer can ensure that, yes, this person is actually deaf and they have the J88 distinction. Next slide. So just in summary, with some of the things Dr. Lomas had shared and myself, we have all these different communication aids and services that can be used. This is not an inclusive list, but we have the communication and the visor cards. We have CART, which we're using for this training, where people are able to access information through a captioning system, a little more sophisticated system. You have a live person transcribing. We have handset amplifiers for hard of hearing people. We have telephones that are more compatible for people with hearing aids. We have video phones, and that's where a deaf person can communicate with another deaf person through sign language. Kind of looks like what we're using now, only we don't have little small pictures. It would be two large pictures going back and forth, communicating. And then we have what was already indicated, video relay service. Now, one service we didn't talk about is called video remote interpreting. So video relay service is actually a free service that you can use as long as you're not physically in the same room with the person you're trying to communicate with. So you could call a deaf person and an interpreter would pop up and communicate. You would not have a fee. Video remote interpreting is a fee-based service. And if there isn't an interpreter readily available, some hospitals use this, some police offices use this, some prisons may use it. Now, we could get into a whole nother training about the pros and cons, because can you imagine if you're sitting with a group of people in a class or in a meeting and everyone's communicating and they're hearing, and you're given a teeny little iPad, and that's where your interpreter is, and that's where you have to watch. It's not always preferred for lengthy kinds of communication. Short term, when emergency settings arrive, maybe. So there's a lot of debate, but it is an option for communication. And then we really want to ensure qualified interpreters when we're involved with interrogations or Miranda warnings or courtroom settings. There are specialized certificates for legal interpreting, for medical interpreting, and it's rare to find those people in every community for sure. So we really want to ensure people are certified and experienced, because it can impact the outcome for the deaf person. And already Dr. Lomas talked about certified deaf interpreters. And again, as we've tried to point out, always ask the deaf or hard of hearing person their communication preference. Don't assume what it might be. Next slide. So now we're going to show a brief clip from the film that Michelle mentioned that we are involved with. Both Dr. Lomas and I are advisors for this film. And I understand that a goal is for Michelle eventually to bring this to you. Now, being Michelle sort of encapsulates everything that Dr. Lomas talked about when he was reviewing language deprivation, especially, and how behavior sometimes can come out when a person is frustrated or not able to fully comprehend or communicate clearly their desires or needs. So this film basically talks about an individual who growing up was in a family situation where the parents were in and out of prison, both drug and alcohol users. She was abused emotionally and sexually. She was involved with some theft because she wanted to be accepted by other kids her age. She was placed in a national program for individuals who are deaf with behavioral issues. There are very few programs to this day that are available if you are working with an individual who is a minor who has either a substance use issue or a behavioral issue. And the program that she was sent to is no longer open. It was closed. And it follows along her course, ending up in prison, and then eventually a guardian taking her out of the prison setting who had been a volunteer in the prison and helping her kind of get through the next few steps. You'll see that there's a lot of trauma for her, a lot of flashbacks for her, and ongoing issues she's had to deal with. The picture she's showing, she drew, and she really got through a lot of the issues that she faced and a lot of the horrible trauma through her drawing, and she was able to depict what happened to her. The purpose of this film is really education and advocacy, and how showing a film like this and having a panel afterwards with discussion and conversation, bringing many of the people like you in the audience together, will hopefully help make a difference in prisons in your communities. And that's really what Gabe's and my desire is in the involvement with this film. We're working on educational materials that can accompany it. And if you go to the next slide, it shows some of the different film festivals that it was in. It's won a number of different awards. So if you're interested in showing it in your community, there's a website you can go to see a little clip. And it's not available unless you go through the right sort of situation to be able to view it. And if you want more information about it, you can contact us. So we're going to go ahead and show a clip and then discuss what we see.
My personal belief about Michelle's case and what she's dealing with right now in the court. I think it's a bogus, trumped up situation. They are looking at her past record because when she was 13 years old, a police officer released a police dog onto Michelle. And when the dog latched onto her leg and she was beating the dog, that dog is considered a police officer. So she was charged with battery on a law enforcement officer. The police officer didn't call the dog off. He just allowed the dog to stay latched to her. So that was the first charge of battery on a law enforcement officer. What is this? How old were you? 18? 18. So you're 18. That was the first time that you were in jail and you were in Placa. And this is Placa. That one's Placa. All of it is Placa? Oh, Michelle. Oh my gosh. Okay. Battery on a Leo. You don't know what that means? That is you hitting an officer. Did you hit an officer? Well, what happened?
2003, battery upon a law enforcement officer. 2004, resisting officer with violence. 2005, battery upon a law enforcement officer. 2006, aggravated battery on a police officer with a deadly weapon. 2011, felony battery in Putnam County. 2011, felony battery. Arson, willful damage to dwelling attempted in 2012.
It's just heartbreaking. I didn't know. I didn't know the other officer was there. When I swung backwards, I caught his leg and it hurt him bad. They shot me with a taser and I was shaking terribly bad. I couldn't move. Then they handcuffed me. Then the officers took me to court. When you came here to this courthouse, the judge, did he give you an interpreter? No. He said I was trouble. I was a lot of trouble growing up. All the time I kept coming in over and over and over. He was mad at me. Very mad. 5 years in prison.
What was it like in Lowell? They had a lot of inmates coming in that kept returning. They had a lot of juveniles that had no idea what to do. They didn't even know how to fold clothes. Some of them were from bad backgrounds. Some was from rich backgrounds. A lot of them, you could tell, just didn't have the upbringing at home. They were just turned loose to do their own. But then you had some that had such great talent that could have been turned around a different way instead of being put in prison.
Lowell Correctional Institution was the most dysfunctional institution I ever was housed in. There wasn't much effort made to help us better ourselves or improve our situation. It was all about suffering and deprivation and pain.
I remember Michelle. I remember her not being able to speak. Michelle's just another person in that prison that shouldn't have been there, probably. Really didn't deserve it. And to know that she went to closed management, and that's a place where not only are you cuffed, you have a black box that goes onto your cuffs to secure that your arms stay at an angle where you can't do anything. And in that box, they take a chain and they waste it around you. They take the clip, they stick it through, they padlock you. The way Michelle is, she can't speak, she can't hear. She needs her hands to talk. Can you imagine going in a shower like this and trying to wash yourself?
When you're in prison, you're less than human. And that's what you're constantly reminded, like every day, it's inmate, inmate, inmate. You're nothing.
Felt her push on me.
Now, these people, they can be strong. She saw the shot the nurse was fixing to give her to calm her down, and we had to call for reinforcements. I mean, it was less like we were nothing. And they coming after you, and it's your life or their life. You're trying to not kill them, but bring them down. So there's a time and a place for most things.
That's the only environment where you could abuse people and get away with it and get paid to be there and get promoted. Being locked in a room was torture. It's meant to break you down. It's meant to destroy your mind. The long-term isolation causes irreparable psychological damage, and it makes people less likely to function normally when they're released, if they make it out of there alive.
She can't speak. She can't tell you nothing. She can't tell on you. You can't even hear her cries. Could you imagine being in prison and somebody can't even hear your cries?
Dr. Guthman, is this me or is this you? I don't remember.
Go ahead, take it away.
Great, great. Well, okay, you guys, you just saw about a 10-minute clip of a film of a documentary that I think hopefully will be shown there in Kentucky in the future. The film itself runs about 85 minutes or so. But you can see from that clip there that lots of different content, lots of low-hanging fruit, the language challenges that she had, and so let's just start with some of these questions here. So she had a number of arrests, and many involved battery charges. What are your thoughts about possible reasons that why various arrests may have occurred? What are your thoughts and reactions to most of the charges that involve some kind of battery? I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next questions, but I'd like to see people
Yeah, keep going,
use the
Gabe.
chat. Yeah. It looks like Michelle asked people to use the chat. So I'm going to keep going and we'll circle back. One of the charges of felony assault charges involve a police dog that bit her. What were your initial reactions to that information? The film talked about a black box being padlocked, including Michelle's hands. What were your initial thoughts and reactions when you saw that? And finally, what is your reaction to the comments that Michelle made about not having an interpreter? And what about the advocate, the woman named Kim? What about her serving as an interpreter? All right, I just see one comment. Oh, here's another one. She might have just been pulling away to try to communicate, but they thought it was resisting arrest. I mean, that's true. Your communication requires your use of hands. So, sometimes when you see the whole film, you'll see that some of her movements may have been interpreted as threatening.
Mm-hmm. And then there's a comment about it's a horrible way to be treated, and the comment about her hands being cuffed without a way to try to communicate. And there are some offices now, law enforcement offices, that do have stipulations as to handcuffing when possible in the front of the body, so there is the ability to communicate. But the things you saw and the treatment that she received, unfortunately, still does occur in a number of different settings. Gabe, are you seeing some other? I didn't
Yeah.
know that the police dog was a charge of assaulting an officer. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to add to that a little bit. I'm very connected to the law enforcement community. I know that the decision to cuff somebody in the front or the back, that's really up to to the police officer's discretion. But in their training, it's usually that you cuff in the back because it's safer. If somebody is really strong and they're really crafty, if they're cuffed in the front, they could still assault you. So it's standard protocol to cuff in the back, but they do have the discretion to cuff in the front.
Mhm.
And now I'm gonna kind of throw something out there and suggest that maybe maybe her reaction, if you notice when they were scrolling on the iPad for looking at her prior charges, maybe some of those reactions where she was most all of those were assault on a Leo, assault on law enforcement. I would contend that most of that is her reaction to trauma. Like she's really in her lower brain and she's trying to get away. The run, hide, fight, sort of feel that she has. And you'll see in the film later when you see the entire film that she does that a lot, where she's gets scared and she runs. She runs away from people. And when you run away from law enforcement, they interpret that as evading arrest. And so your charges get increased when you're evading arrest, or the hiding or the fighting. So when they catch her, when they hold her down, she fights back. It's just a real primal instinct to do something like that. So cooperating with the police requires a pretty high level functioning that I don't really see that Michelle has in the film.
Mhm. There was
Debbie?
another comment too that we'll share another example later that really talks about how when a person is agitated, that sign language can sometimes be misinterpreted for violence or for a different kind of interaction than is just communication. So that sometimes it can be misinterpreted. And I'm going to share an example of that. So that was raised. And then just how heartbreaking it is, and that she didn't really have an interpreter. And when you see the film, you'll see that that is sort of the theme of the film. And that really evokes a lot of emotion, especially for people in the deaf community, because communication is so very important. And it is her story. And unfortunately, we see this happening as well. A lot of the individuals I know within the prison settings, the only time there's an interpreter is if it's a medical appointment or an emergency. For any other kinds of situations, very rarely are interpreters provided. And even if there's funds to provide interpreters, it's very difficult to find individuals who are interested in working in that environment. And especially when some of the prisons are located in more rural areas. And your state has a lot of rural areas. So even though the desire to hire is there, it can be a challenge. And Michelle, in so many ways, just really, you could go point by point of system failure, really, and what happened to her throughout her life. She was in a positive foster environment and returned home to the abusing environment. She was violated in many ways that contributed to the trauma, the PTSD that she had, and the medication she was on. Did you notice how she looks now versus how she looked in those earlier pictures? She was on a huge list of different kinds of medications that were impacting her medically.
Yeah, I find it fascinating, Dr. Guthman, that she is able to, like, I think when you parallel the medication, the pictures of the medication too, and how she looks, also this medication that's supposed to be helping her psychologically, psychiatrically, is causing her to have hallucinations. If you notice that she talked about in the cell that there was a little girl, that was all, psychiatric medication induced. Should we go next, continue on?
Yeah. Yep.
Well, thank you all for that, for watching that bit of the film and for contributing in the chat. We're going to go on to some other topics that are related. And one of the roles that I do quite a bit, and I honestly enjoy the role, is doing competency evaluations. I do go around the country quite a bit when there's complex, cases with deaf people, and I do evaluations. And I sort of there was a little bit of there was a request to put in a few months ago when we were preparing to please touch on competency evaluation. I wasn't sure which direction, but we have a couple of slides here that address that topic. On the left-hand side, you'll see some problems, and then you'll see some better practices on the right-hand side. From my experience, what we see is what I see as a problem is that oftentimes we state employees are required to use approved contractors. I do get that. That makes sense. An approved contractor sort of has met your standard and has an agreed upon, fee schedule, things like that. But approved contractors really don't do some of the more specialized work that we're talking about today. So having a mechanism for having alternative contractors, people who like myself, who can come in and do an evaluation is really important. When some jurisdictions re are really rigid and they'll say we can only use an approved contractor, and that's not going to meet, all of the needs of all of the people who are charged in your community. There's also, this is a big problem, an illusion of comprehension. Deaf people oftentimes will nod their heads just to try to communicate. And sometimes when there's an interpreter there, there's still maybe the interpreters sometimes will give you feedback, sometimes they will not. But the interpreter's doing their job, putting the verbal language into sign language and probably doing a great job. But if you think back to those earlier slides, we were talking about language deprivation. Some deaf people don't really have the skills to understand that sign language interpreter. I see this quite a bit in the prison system. When I go into a prison to do an evaluation, the person may have some basic sign skills, but they're really not that sophisticated. It's pretty simplistic. And so the comprehension that I think they're giving the court is really an illusion. It's not real. It's not strong because their comprehension is actually in reality very limited. Now, in general, I don't want to oversimplify, but a lot of times one of the other problems is over reliance on verbal tests. Now, we in our field are trained to administer tests, and we use language as a construct for cognition and for measuring academic, ability. There's nothing wrong with that if the person can hear the language, but if the person hasn't really had good access to hearing growing up, it makes absolutely no sense to rely on verbal scoring. And yet, oftentimes, probably 9 times out of 10, when I get involved in a court case and I see what the local person has done, they've included a lot of verbal language in that evaluation. Sometimes there's a lot of misinterpretation, like they'll say that behavior is related to hearing loss, or poor low IQ is related to hearing loss. So IQ and hearing loss are really not related at all. Now, reading and hearing loss is because of the person. Reading requires phonology, it requires an understanding of hearing. And so that can be related to hearing loss. But really, there's an overgeneralization sometimes where people don't understand deafness and they will relate some of the problem behavior to hearing loss. And that's why we said earlier in the presentation that deaf people don't commit crimes at higher rates than hearing people. Deafness itself, hearing loss itself, does not contribute to these problems. Misrepresentation that the court views as factual. Like sometimes things that are brought up in court are inaccurate. They're misrepresentations of deaf people, but the court will accept that as fact. And until someone like Dr. Guthman or I get involved, then they will persist in these misrepresentations. Also, if you think about it, these are really high stakes consequences. Like the you know an inappropriate evaluation could lead to an outcome in court that will cause a parent to lose custody of a child, or will cause an individual to lose their freedom and maybe locked up and incarcerated. And so it's so important to make sure that the evaluations done in court are effective and accessible. And also, finally, we'll talk about this a little more later too, but the language of court is very complex. The language that we often see is so challenging, and yet we try to try to give it to an interpreter to translate. But most of the time, I think it's still going to go over people's heads. It's challenging for me to understand, I think, and I have a lot of experience and expertise in working in courts. So in better practices, we want to make sure that we use that we interview the client and the family, and that we do those interviews in the person's first language, or their strongest language. And we take historical records, we collect information about medications, we do the entire administration in their strongest language. And we lean on nonverbal testing, nonverbal results for cognitive and nonverbal results for academic, because that's going to give us the best picture of how the person functions. Measures of personality can be really challenging. If a person has really strong reading, then they can perhaps answer some of the personality tests that we administer in the field, but in general, those of us who work in the field know that personality tests are often very heavily weighted in complicated English. Like, for example, asking questions that have double negatives in other complicated language, where that the person reading them is going to get confused, and they see maybe a negative word and they say no, when answering no pathologizes them. So it's very confusing. So measures of personality really have to be limited. All of these measures need to be done in ASL, but we also need to have ways to measure a person's ability to use language. And that would include both English, written English, spoken English, and American Sign Language. So, when I would do an evaluation, I would have procedures to try to get a sense for the person's ability to communicate effectively in both spoken English, if possible, written English, and then in American Sign Language. We want measures of language ability in English and other languages, and then measures of behavior, trauma, anxiety, depression. So if it's a child, we often focus on their behavior. If it's an adult, we'd focus on their personality, and then we'd want to focus in on other areas too, like what have they experienced, and that would be this better practice column. This would be typical areas that I would focus on when I'm going to do an evaluation for court. Okay, now specific to competency is the Dusky Standard. Everybody here probably has heard of the Dusky Standard. So, and the Dusky Standard says that a defendant has to be able to understand the charges against them and assist their lawyer in their defense. So to meet the Dusky Standard, a person has to be able to use language expressively and receptively with or without accommodation. So if it's a deaf person, they can use a sign language interpreter as long as they're understanding what is going on and as long as they can make contributions back to their own defense. But to know for sure that they're understanding, we do need to have language assessment, academic achievement assessment, and other areas as well to make sure that the person really truly is understanding. Okay, so now here's a case that kind of illustrates what I was just talking about. So I apologize for reading that out loud too, but I think it'll help us if we stay together. So this is Martha. She's a 35-year-old deaf woman who got pregnant unexpectedly, and she was impregnated by someone she really didn't know too well. Now she had a car, she had a job, and she had a home, and she also had extended family who lived nearby. Her cognitive functioning is around 80. So before I go any further, I'm going to pause right there. I didn't give you guys an explanation of cognition before this. So an average cognitive score is 100. Standard deviation is 15. So 100 minus 15 is 85. Then two standard deviations would be 70. Okay, and two standard deviation is when we start to identify a person as intellectually disabled. So Martha is kind of in the middle, in between average and then the disabled area. So her functioning is really considered low average. During her medical checkup, she reported to the nurse that she heard voices that told her to kill her baby. She told the nurse that she wants to have the baby, but she wants psychiatric help. So in other words, she's telling the nurse, like, I'm worried about myself. Like I'm hearing voices that say to harm the baby, and I don't like to hear those voices. I want help. Now the nurse reported her to CPS, and after a brief series of medications, she told the nurse that she was still struggling. But about a month later, at 6 months gestation, she got a new doctor because that psych nurse was not able to help her, and the doctor gave her a spot-on prescription. And about 3 months later, she gave birth to the baby, but CPS was waiting to take custody. Now, after a year of having no custody and only visits with the baby, the state decided that they would permanently remove custody from this mother. Now, after an evaluation by a psychologist who was skilled in ASL, it was clear that the evidence did not support removal of her custodial rights. The local psychologist made significant mistakes. They estimated her IQ at about 70, and then also contended that she was unfit to parent. And now, even when mistakes were revealed, the state would not drop their case. Martha had to use a charitable law practice to fight for her rights while the state had significant resources to use against her. Now, this was amazing because a nonprofit hired me to come in and to do an outside evaluation. And the state is powerful. I spent a lot of time working for the state, and I know that their resources are immense. And oftentimes when I would get involved in a case, they would often sort of realize that they made a mistake and drop the charges. But this one kind of went on a little bit. My point is that in this case, I felt like Martha was competent and she was able to defend herself. She had a job. She had a lot of good things going for her. And yet the local person made an error and and the state, went with that error. All right, we're going to transition topics a little bit. I'm going to talk about some of the things that contribute to school to prison. So we're thinking about what happens when some of the people who we see as adults when they're young, what causes them to end up in this pipeline going towards prison? And one of the things that I think is a problematic is really cognition. Like I mentioned before, about between 30 and 50% of deaf school age kids have disabilities or they have language deprivation and they have learning challenges. So also, today's causes of deafness have cognitive implications. So we think about like, who are these people? Who are these kids that we're locking up in prison? A lot of them really have difficulty understanding language and understanding the environment around them. What are the causes of deafness? Well, we know genetics causes about 10% of deafness, but then there's other conditions that cause deafness too, including like syndromes and other illnesses that may also have cause other learning challenges. And so when a person is affected like that, oftentimes that leaves them with poor decision making. Or like Michelle, they're functioning more in the lower stem of their brain. So it's really basic needs that are being met by their behavior, and they're not really using like higher levels of thinking. So like, oh, I'm mad, but I'm not going to show I'm mad. I'm going to self-regulate. People who function in that lower area don't do that. If they're mad, they show you they're mad, If they're scared, they run, they hide, or they fight. They don't sit and talk to a person and say, "Hey, you're scaring me," you know? So these causes of deafness often have consequences that affect someone's functioning. Now, I mentioned before intellectually disabled disability is diagnosed when an IQ score is below 30 and adaptive behavior is below 30. But our DSM-5, which has been around for about 5 or 6 years now, it's been around for several years, has provisions for flexibility with those numbers. So I have met people who function above that, like 72, 73, but they can't read a map. They can't pass a driving test and all that. So functionally they're functioning at the intellectually disabled area, but on a test their scores are a little bit above. So the DSM does allow us to diagnose somebody as intellectually disabled. And I think that's not really happening very much. I've done that only a couple of times. And I think that, as psychologists, other evaluators need to be trained to identify like that space.
Gabe, there was a question. Do you want to
Yep.
just, the Individual Disability Education Act, a question about what that is?
Oh, okay, yeah. Let's see, I'm 2 points away from that. So I'll expand on that in just 1 second. So many deaf youth function at the 70s and 80s. In other words, they're not in the 100 category, but they're also not intellectually disabled. So when they have low average or borderline functioning, they're below average. That really does make a big difference in their decision-making abilities. And for example, we saw that Dr. Guthman was sharing that Michelle, her first charge was for stealing a CD, music, right? She'll tell you in the film later when you see the film, I'm deaf. Why would I want music? But her friend put it in her bag, and then she walked out of the store with it because she wanted to fit in. She wanted to have a friend, and so her decision-making ability, in my opinion, is impaired. Um, then IDEA, that's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It often contributes to misdiagnosis among deaf people, and the way it does it is that it typically assigns a primary disability. And so when people have multiple disabilities, they will often identify only the primary disability. So sometimes we see kids who are deaf with who appear to be deaf, but there really are much more complicated consequences because of their disability. So I think the question here is, what's your intuition about Michelle? So I've never evaluated Michelle and I've never seen any of her evaluations, but I would sort of imagine that Michelle has more than just hearing loss going on, more than just deafness. Like she's got a complicated case. You know, I happen to be in touch with people who help Michelle on a daily basis, and we know that even though Michelle can live independently, she needs help paying her bills. She needs a little bit of help managing her money. And so because she can't live independently and because she needs some assistance, it's pretty clear that she has functioning that's below average. And that probably had consequences for her going to jail. All right, another contributor to this, I think, are ACEs. And now, probably a lot of you have heard about ACEs. It used to be under the radar, and now it's very much on everybody's radar. These are adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And a study by the Kaiser Clinic, many years ago, actually, um, found that what they were trying to do actually with Kaiser was to save money for their system. So they're trying to figure out who are more expensive clients. So what they did was they gave them a questionnaire, and the questionnaire asked them 10 questions. They weren't these questions on the right, but this is what they were getting at. Like, has anybody ever harmed you or threatened to harm you? Have you ever been assaulted, physically assaulted? Or number three, sexually assaulted? Do you feel loved by the people around you? Were you neglected when you were younger? Did you have your basic needs met? Were your parents separated or divorced? Did you witness violence? Was there alcoholism or drug use in your home? Was there someone with mental illness in your home? And did a family member go to prison? So these questions were asked on a survey, and the results were shocking and groundbreaking. Like we began to see that when people answered yes to one question, that we started to see increases in some health outcomes. But then two, three, four, five, like it became overwhelming. Like we could see that people in prison, I think something like, okay, if you look at the bullet point number two, 97% of the prison population has at least one ACE, and 78% of the prison population has four or more ACEs. And people with ACEs usually end up with poorer health outcomes and lower lifespan. So what this tells us is that we have to be doing more work, in the early stages. When children are young, we have to make sure that they have good nurturing environments, that they're not neglected, that they feel loved, they're protected from assault, that they are not exposed to drugs and alcohol use in the home. And so a lot of this is really important. And I think we think about deaf kids, like when they're raised in homes like this, like Michelle was raised in a home like this where there was drug use and parental involvement with the justice system and on and on and on, and we can see that the outcomes here were pretty dire for her. Okay, here's another case. This is Alex, and for the sake of us being together, I'm going to read it together, okay? So Alex is 15. He has an IQ of 77. His reading achievement is 64, and his math is 71. So I'm painting a picture of a teenager who's not I mean, his reading is delayed, but that's often because he's deaf. But his IQ at 77, that's really in the borderline range. You've got average, low average, borderline, and then disabled. And so he's in that borderline range. He uses ASL pretty well, and he gets along well with others. He has a moderate hearing loss in his speech that allows him to communicate with his hearing peers. So he can talk a little, and he's trying to make friends with hearing peers. While his deaf peers are usually kind to him, his hearing peers often set up negative situations so they can laugh at him. In spite of that, he's so eager to be accepted by his hearing peers. They told him that a girl named Sue likes him and wants him to send her nude photos. So they send him some nude photos of a girl they claim is Sue, and Alex gets excited and sends Sue nude photos of himself. Sue became upset and told the school resource officer, who arrested Alex and took his phone. And the officer told Alex that if there's any child pornography on his phone, he'll be charged with distribution of pornographic material, as well as sexual harassment against Sue. So my question here is, do you think his cognitive challenges contributed to his arrest? And do you think his cognitive condition will cause problems for him with police, court, and others in the system? And if so, how? Do you think he can contribute to his own defense here, the Dusky Standard? So I'd like for you guys to kind of be able to comment in the chat, but I don't want to lose time. So I'm going to go ahead and make a few comments about this situation. This is something that I see a lot. It's very common for young people to share nude photos with each other. So it's really important that schools and that parents know what kind of content that they have if we're going to prevent that. But really what happens a lot is young kids like Alex, kids who have intellectual delays or intellectual disabilities, really have a different framework and that they be educated on how to manage the technology. If they can't manage the technology, then maybe they're not ready for some of that technology. Yeah, somebody says he's more likely to resist those peers if the suggestion of the suggestion of his IQ was higher. Yeah, he's not making good decisions. He really wants, and that's I think another piece too, is that a lot of times younger people, everybody has a sexual drive. Well, he has a sexual drive, but he's not able to control it because he's really functioning at a more basic level with his lower brainstem drives. Okay, now here's Greg. Greg is 18. Now Greg is a real case. This one's pretty sad. He's 18 years old, he's deaf, and he's gay. His reading level is at the first grade and his IQ is 82. So again, 100 is average, 15 points is the standard deviation. So he's just below the average range. He's into the low average range. He just graduated from high school and he's living at home. His parents are Mexican immigrants who are living in Kentucky legally, and they're growing wheat and barley on their farm. While their school recommended that Greg go to a transitional living and employment program, the parents said their culture stipulates that Greg stay at home and work on the farm. Greg knows sign language pretty well, but his parents don't sign. So Greg's really lonely and he spends a lot of time on his computer. He's eager to find other gay teens who live in the area, and he finds a boy who's 14 and lives nearby, and they plan to meet. Of course, law enforcement's tipped off, and Greg is found with the boy and he's arrested. So, does Greg have aces? Do you think Greg understood the gravity of his offense? Could language deprivation contribute to this problem? Could IQ be a factor here? And do you think Greg could defend himself? Would he meet the Dusky standard? Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to make a few comments here. I see that somebody made a comment probably about the prior slide. This one is horribly sad. Like when I met Greg, he thought that he was arrested for being gay, and he didn't really understand this idea that he should not be attracted to or not be dating someone who's that much younger than him. So he thought that he was doing something legal. He was looking for someone to date. He's seen people find romance on the internet, and so he was eager to do the same. And when he found somebody, and it happened that the younger person was already a perpetrator, had bounced around to different group homes and had been in the juvenile justice system. And so really, in my mind, the younger person was more of the aggressor. Greg was looking for romance, but he found it in the wrong place. Um, it looks like somebody's asking about the break, and I think we're supposed to take a break at 3. So maybe is this a good time? We're still about 2 minutes ahead of break time. Should I go ahead and break?
Michelle?
There's one question or one comment in the chat about recommended cognitive testing for intellectual disabilities. Maybe if you could answer that, and then we could take a break.
Sure. Okay, let me read the question. Is it this one? What is recommended cognitive testing for diagnosing IDD in deaf populations? I was thinking comprehensive IQ. The WAIS-5, for example, were not normed on individuals who are deaf. So is it possible these IQ scores using the assessments aren't a valid representation? What's recommended? Yeah, I think, well, typically what I would do is I would look at their priors, like if they've been evaluated in school, And then that would sort of set a foundation for what I'm going to do currently. Now, believe it or not, the WISC and the WAIS both have some research with deaf people. So in their manuals, if you flip through the early pages, they'll tell you if you're going to administer to deaf people, here's what we recommend. And if you follow those recommendations, you should be in pretty good shape. I mean, really what they're doing is they're leaning a lot on their nonverbal tests. They're saying we do not recommend you use these tests. And if you look at those are mostly the verbal tests. And we do recommend that you use these tests. And there have been some studies to contribute to that research. So I think that if you're following that, you're going to probably be in good shape. But before we close for our break, I want to just underscore that um, that no matter what, in an ideal situation, we really want to make sure that we are evaluating people in their strongest language. So if you're assigning psychologist or assigning evaluator, that would be the perfect match or person who is deaf who uses sign language. If you don't sign it and you use an interpreter, I would recommend that you make an effort to find someone who does sign and who can do that evaluation before you fall back on the use of an interpreter. Michelle, should I read this other question or should we pause?
I think a pause will be great. We're right at 3 o'clock. So if we want to break until about 3:10 and come back, that will give everyone a chance to rest their eyes or take a bio break.
Thank you.
Tracy, are you good to go?
Yes.
Excellent. Welcome back to our training. We were just checking to make sure we had all of our communication access in place. Thank you so much, Dr. Lomas and Dr. Guthman.
Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for coming back. I hope you guys got refreshed there for those few minutes. I'm going to continue, but just as a heads up, Dr. Guthman and I just sort of reviewed our pace, and I need to pick it up a little. So I'm going to probably skip the next case, or I may just sort of, without reading it in process, and I'll probably just summarize things real quick. Okay. So here we go. So here's another thing that really kind of gets me is zero tolerance policies. What happened really with deaf education is it's decentralized. It's spread out. It used to be housed mostly at schools for the deaf, but now we're seeing, deaf kids in public schools across the landscape. And what happens when you do that is that the experience of being a deaf child gets watered down. They don't have access to the same programs. Like, and let me give you a quick example. Schools have social emotional learning programs. And so when those are delivered, they often either are not delivered to deaf kids or maybe they're delivered with an interpreter. Social emotional learning programs are pretty powerful, and I think they're essential for deaf kids. Like what happens with deaf kids, a lot of young deaf kids that I've met often don't know how to label their feelings. These are things that you and I pick up from our parents and from the environment around us. We begin to label our feelings, and then and then the next step to labeling those feelings is to self-regulate, to manage those new labels that we have for our feelings. If you don't have a label for your feeling, you're not going to self-regulate, and you're going to have problems, until you begin to have a feelings vocabulary. So SEL that's designed for deaf kids really is the first step to keeping them safe and to keeping them from that prison pathway. Peer groups are also very, very limited. Oh, go ahead.
I just want to add, even at deaf schools, there's so much pressure now on academics and exit exams that you don't see the same program options for even prevention of substance use, different things that a lot of individuals end up being incarcerated for. Plus, as Dr. Lomas said, the SEL programs, more and more, even at schools for the deaf, with those pressures, we're not seeing those things. People have to make choices and they're going the academic route, which to me, I think you can make an argument that your emotional ability, your knowledge about how to not to harm your body with drugs and alcohol, and how to prevent possibly later kinds of interactions with the police is a life skill that is important.
Yeah. And likewise, the next bullet here, where social peer groups are limited, we get a lot of learning from by being around other people. And when a deaf child goes to a school where they're the only deaf child, or they're one of just two or three, they don't have that exposure to testing limits and to identifying, how to like connect with other people, dealing, dating, being a part of sports and things like that. So it really limits their ability when peer groups are limited. And then also, this is also one of the ones that I really want to underscore that I feel like is a major void is teaching of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA is going to be the number one law that deaf people will use when they are trying to navigate the justice system. In public schools, the deaf ed teachers generally follow the general curriculum, and the general curriculum has no requirement to teach with the ADA. And what I'm seeing is it's often absent. It's often left out of the curriculum. So this is the case of Romero, which I'm going to just quickly, comment about, and I'm not going to read it. Romero was from another country, and this happens quite a bit where a parent has a child with a disability. They realize my home country is not an effective place for my child to be raised. They don't have the kind of programming that we need. And so his mother immigrates to the United States, and then she settles down in Louisville, and then after a couple of years, she's raised enough money to bring her son, and he's already like 12 years old, and he doesn't have any sign language and doesn't have any speech, and so he gets in trouble with the law, and it is a very challenging kind of situation for Romero. His cognition is delayed, and his ability to sort of protect himself from those other kids is really limited. Third-party reimbursement is another problem. Our healthcare system is designed as a for-profit system, and I don't really want this to be like a political, platform. Not at all. Like, I think, if for-profit nature of healthcare, if that's what works the best, and that's fine. But we need to also understand that deaf people will often require a lot more supports when they're in a healthcare system, and this would include behavioral health as well. Interpreters are really just the tip of the iceberg. Like, we need a great deal of technology. Sometimes we need longer periods of care. We need training for specialized providers like addiction counselors and others, and I think when I think about systems, I think about concentric circles. Like I mentioned earlier, a case where there was a deaf woman involved with CPS. Well, Child Protective Services is not just CPS. Like, they have concentric circles outside of those agencies, such as parent education programs, sometimes parole or probation. Like, if a parent has been in trouble with the law, there's all these other providers that work in that same orbit that need to be fluent in sign language, in my opinion, if we're gonna effectively, support these systems. And so we need to have systems that can work that are not so focused on profit, but focused on needs of the patients or the clients. And one of the problems is that we do see this as a low incidence population. So maybe Kentucky doesn't need this, but if you were to gather all the deaf people with psychiatric needs in 2 or 3 states around Kentucky, we definitely could set up a regional low incidence treatment programming, because we definitely have that need. Also, when that would be what I just referenced was mandated care, but also just finding general healthcare services. Like, if I'm a parent and I have a deaf child and my child's got some behavioral issues and I want to take them to a provider, finding an accessible signing provider is difficult, and healthcare organizations are often reluctant to pay for interpreters. And so what they often will do is they will speed up the service and say, "Oh, your child is done," in just 2 or 3 days, or they will maybe cut off the service and say they no longer need the service. And so really the framework that we have for financing healthcare works against deaf people. I love this video, but I'm not going to show it. I just want you, if you want to Google it, I'm going to tell you it's like a 5-minute video, and I'm going to try to explain it to you in about 30 seconds. This is Dr. Saul Kassin, Kassin, and this is a very popular YouTube video where he explains to you why false confessions and why he sees this so much. He's a professor at John Jay College of Justice in New York City. And he's very well known for his work on false confessions. And really, the reality that we have to think about too, this is a contributor to that school to prison pipeline as well, because police can lie to anybody. They're allowed during their interrogations to lie to you. It's legal for law enforcement to lie in the United States. It's not in some other countries, but that's part of the fabric of our system. The police can tell you something like, "Oh, we found your DNA at the crime scene," or something like that. And now, then the deaf person who may be functioning at an IQ of, say, 70, 71, they're already not sure of what's real and what's not real, will often just confess because they're under so much stress. There's strategies that law enforcement uses, to sort of force the confessions. So oftentimes we see deaf people who falsely confess they have an IQ between 68 and 80. So they are maybe mildly intellectually disabled, or they're borderline functioning. They often have limited capacity. They're vulnerable to being fooled. They may have poor ego strength, and they often will acquiesce to hearing people because they see them as authority. And so they will falsely confess to crimes that they haven't committed, or they will confess when maybe they have committed a crime, but it's not quite at the extent, but they will confess to that crime, to a much greater extent. So we see that on the left-hand side here that law enforcement can lie. They can scare suspects by telling them that they're going to be arrested, or they're going to be incarcerated, and if they just tell the truth, that they will have a lesser consequence. The interview will often run for hours, causing fatigue. They will give them confusing scenarios. They will sometimes threaten them, or they will sometimes use a promise, which is also a lie, oftentimes. And deaf people will often, typically developing people might, our heart rate gets up, we get nervous, we get scared. Sometimes, we might tell law enforcement, like, wait a minute, this is not making any sense at all. It's time for this to stop, and I'm gonna get an attorney. So if we have a strong ego strength, we will stand up to the police. A lot of deaf people will begin to doubt themselves. They will become fatigued. They'll become overwhelmed, and might even work with law enforcement to develop their own confession. Okay, I'm going to transfer this over to Dr. Guthman now.
Now we're going to start moving more into what happens then when a person is involved in the criminal justice system. We've talked about some cases. We've talked a lot about some of the gaps and causes for a person ending up there. And this is another example where communication really affected the outcome of this case. And so in this particular situation, where a person may confess because they don't understand what they're confessing to, but it's upheld. So this is a really very sad situation about a person named Felix Garcia. Next slide, please. So basically what happened in the case about Felix is that he, in 1983, so a long time ago, he was 19. He's been in prison really since that time period. He was framed and sentenced to life in prison, and it was a murder that he claims he did not commit. He signed a pawn shop receipt for a ring at the request of his older brother and sister. He didn't know that the ring was stolen. And at the time that this occurred, he was not fluent in sign language. He became deaf due to ear infections. And so his communication was limited. You learned about how lip reading is not really a very good way to have communication happen. We know that 20 to 30% maybe are visible on lips, and really some people are better at lip reading than others, but it's not something to rely on. So he ended up going to trial for this murder, and the court failed to provide him an interpreter or adequate service to make sure he could understand the proceedings. He was provided with a loudspeaker, which he had to turn up to full volume. And then he had to turn it off because there was feedback that it made, and it was distracting. So then they gave him a hearing aid. Now, for those of you who are familiar with hearing aids, you go for testing. An ear mold is made. It's specifically for your ear. They gave him a court-appointed hearing aid to stick in his ear as if it didn't matter. Well, that didn't work for him. It wasn't made for his ears. It did not help him in comprehension. He then was convicted of this first-degree murder and armed robbery only because of this signed pawn shop receipt. So really the inability to hear and this lack of support to ensure that he understood the proceedings played a central role in the conviction. Next slide. So since that time, some of the things that did occur is that the sister, well, going back to the trial, the sister then, when she was called to speak, he thought she was speaking on his behalf, defending him. He didn't realize until he saw the transcripts later that she was actually testifying against him. He answered yes to questions he didn't hear, he didn't understand, because he thought it would make things move along quicker and he could go home. So again, there was just that one piece of physical evidence. Now, years later, his brother and sister actually recanted and gave affidavits that he was innocent. He had witnesses that said that he was across town during the time this murder was committed. He's applied and been denied clemency for being released from prison. A few years ago, many people in the deaf community were asked to write letters to help as they were trying to advocate for him to be let out of prison, and it was not successful. So he is still in prison. Now, he has learned some sign language since that time, but this is an excellent example of really something where a person was wrongfully imprisoned. Next slide. Case of Richard. Dr. Lomas has talked a lot about school age. This is a case that I had been involved with. I worked at a school for the deaf for a number of years, and I was responsible to be the contact with the police. And when we had legal kinds of actions, I would go with the lawyers to represent the school, and I oversaw all clinical aspects of the school. And one of the things that is so important that we talked a little bit about, students that are in special ed are eligible for education until they turn 22. So that means at a school for the deaf, you have kids from birth, infancy, up till age 22. And although they may be in different departments, there are opportunities where kids who are in high school turn 18 and they may be dating individuals under 18. It happens even in the public high school system. So Richard, who was 17 and was dating a girl who was 16, turned 18. Now, it was important to keep in mind that Richard had a modified curriculum, was physically very astute. He was a good-looking kid. He was on the football team. He was very athletic, but he would have fit that sort of borderline in terms of his ability to function level that Dr. Lomas talked about. So the protocol is if there's any kind of sexual contact on the campus, police are notified. And we tried to work with the same officer as much as we could. It just works better if they understand how to work with the sign language interpreter and sort of the protocol for the school. This particular time, it was in the evening. And so an officer came who had never come to the school before. And unbeknownst to us, instead of just taking the student to the police station, contacting the parent, they took him to prison. And it's actually the prison where, if you remember that Lacey Peterson murder, it's where he was held. It's where there were violent people held in that prison. The family lived several hours away. It was not an intact family. By the time we realized that he was in prison, he was in the same general milieu as with all of these other inmates. I went to court for his first court appearance, as did our social worker. There was no interpreter. He was scared. He was tearful. He was sent back to prison because of the court not following up with their due diligence of having communication available for this individual. So there's several lessons learned from this experience. First, education provided to those individuals who are in schools interacting with individuals who are under age 18, more advocacy, more education. We talked about how academics take precedent over emotional kinds of education, prevention education, and this is another area of need. So Richard ended up actually having felony charges, which were going to stay with him and really make a difference for him long-term because of the incident that occurred here at school. Next slide. We're going to share a video with you a couple excerpts, and I want to just paint the picture first. The case that I was asked to get involved with was an interrogation that occurred with an individual, and my role was to determine if her lack of communication that was provided basically violated her rights. So there were two videos that I was asked to view. The first video had herself, Mary we'll call her, who was 30, had a mixed hearing loss in the right ear, severe to profound left ear. She used sign language interpreters growing up. She went to a mainstream program. Her records indicated that she struggled academically. In California, there's a requirement for having an exit exam in both math and English, and she had taken it 4 times unsuccessfully. So the reason she was called in is there were some injuries caused to her child. So when she went in the first time, a friend of hers came with, and her friend happened to know sign language. And when viewing the video, I didn't know whether she was a certified sign language interpreter or just someone who happened to have conversational skill. Throughout the interview, when Mary would speak and the police did not understand her speech, he would look to this friend to help voice what was being said or clarify. Likewise, when the police would ask questions and Mary didn't understand, she would look to her friend who was signing appropriately throughout this interview. So that's how that first interview went. It was clear she wasn't under arrest. She could leave at any time. There was a follow-up interview about a week later, and that's because some additional information was found out. Now, I was very surprised to see that for the second interview, which is what we're going to see a few excerpts from, there was no interpreter and there was no friend who could sign. So what you're going to see is just this police officer with this individual following up with no other communication. So I'm going to ask Gabe to go to the next slide, and we're going to go to just look at a little bit at 1823 for a minute or so.
And obviously you're hearing impaired. Are you completely deaf without your hearing aids?
Yeah.
You are. Okay. Do you have any other disabilities? None? Okay. Are you taking any medication?
I am.
What are you taking? Is there a lot?
I'm not.
Okay.
Mostly I'm not my bipolar.
Okay, so you're bipolar. So you've been diagnosed with bipolar.
The worst thing is I think that other people are saying, but
Like doctors.
just yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
My meditation. I'm using bipolar, depression, my diet, and
Hang on. I didn't understand that. So is it bipolar,
bipolar,
depression,
and diet,
anxiety?
and then I'm picking up my irritation, my anger issues.
You taking medication for anger issues?
Yes.
What medication is that?
Ativan.
Ativan.
And Lifidone.
Do you have anger issues?
Okay, let's
Have
go
anger
on,
issues?
Gabe, before we talk about this. Let's go to 24.58.
What's the game plan for that?
Right now she's not with me. I'm journeying with my mom. Up to Monday, I have an appointment with the publisher.
The what?
I have an appointment on Monday with the publisher.
One more time. I
The
understand.
publisher.
Counselor?
Company.
Oh, okay. Okay.
That that's the first step in doing talk
Okay.
out everything.
And so at this point, this has to CFS is
Okay,
involved.
let's go to the last
His
clip,
child use, okay.
3526.
So I really don't want you to have any contact with Josie. Okay, this has to be. So the and just to make sure, just because of your hearing impairment, everything, you're completely understanding everything I'm saying, right? Okay, you're reading my lips too. Okay, and you can also hear my voice.
Yeah, I can imagine like after I do a few minutes and I'm able to pick up.
Okay, so you can hear and read lips. Okay. How long have you been communicating like that?
Years.
Years. Okay, so you're pretty good at it. Okay. Anything else that you think I need to know about? Okay.
Okay, let's go ahead and stop the video. Now you just saw a few clips from this video, and I'm sure that the hair on the back of your neck stood up at a few things. So you learned early on that there are certain preferred ways to communicate or to label people. One, you saw that he was using hearing impaired repeatedly. Two, he talked about you can read my lips, and we've already discussed that. And she's in a situation where she's nervous. Obviously, she's being interrogated by a police officer. And he had multiple times where he was not understanding what she was saying. And one of the ones that stood out for me especially was when she said that she was going to see a psychologist. Multiple times he asked her to repeat what she said. And then he said, "Oh, a counselor." And so she just changed what she had said to match what he assumed she was saying, even though it wasn't. And there is a difference, as we know, between a counselor and a psychologist. So there were a number of issues that were really done poorly in this interrogation. The other thing is, in reading through the requirements for that particular department, they don't want you to ask questions in the way he did at the end. The way they advise the police officers is to have the individual repeat back to you for clarification, and also not to ask yes and no questions. So for instance, at the end, "You're understanding everything I'm saying, right?" "Oh, yes, I'm understanding everything you're saying." "And you can lip read what I'm saying." "Yes, I can lip read what you're saying." So those are not protocol and not ways that you would typically want to carry out this kind of interrogation. So one of the questions I would pose is, do you feel that her communication access was inappropriately provided and resulted in her not getting a fair and impartial opportunity for this case? Do you feel that there should have been a sign language interpreter or some other way of communication with her? And I'm saying an absolutely. So I think everything we've talked about comes through loud and clear when you see an actual example that unfortunately wasn't that long ago. So next slide. And the results that I also concurred was that the officer was negligent and did violate her right to communication access by not having sign language interpreter available to her during the first or second interview. And the comment, "A deaf person has the right to an interpreter." Well, and the thing that is confusing sometimes for people, because a person can understand someone's speech most of the time, first of all, doesn't mean that they can understand you. And second of all, if you looked at her preference or asked her preference, she had utilized sign language interpreting throughout her life. So even if some of her language was intelligible, that is not a fair way to conduct an interrogation. Next slide. Another situation, and this is the one where someone in their comments talked about sometimes how sign language can look like be misunderstood for being something violent. If I'm upset or angry and I'm signing large, someone could think, if they're just watching me, that I'm causing harm to someone or becoming violent. And that's exactly what happened in this case. So this is a deaf man from Austin, Texas, who actually sued the police after a tasing incident. Next slide. So he was out with his family, his wife and 3 children. They had gone to a restaurant. They were in the car, and he and his wife had an argument. And they pulled over the car, got outside to argue, so they weren't arguing in front of the children. And then John walked away to a parking lot while Mary followed along in a car. Well, a neighbor saw this interaction when they were standing outside of the car and assumed, because it was intense in ASL, that it was domestic violence or a domestic disturbance. 3 officers arrive at the scene and tase John in front of his wife and children. Now, one of the officers wrote in a notes app that they tased him because they thought he may have been reaching for a weapon. And the officer said, "We never would have done so in the beginning if we knew you were deaf." Next slide. And then there was some disagreement whether or not they knew he was deaf or not, but this is the results of the tasing incident. Next slide. So at this time, John is in the process of filing charges against San Marcos, the city, and the officers, alleging violations of his civil rights and ADA discrimination, and believes that the officers used excessive force. So if you think about it, the long-term impact that John will experience because of this encounter and the kind of community-based resources that exist to really help him, and what kind of education and training is needed to the police officers so that when they come out, they don't make the assumption immediately based on the report from the neighbor. So this is another example where the sign language was misconstrued to be thinking that a person was being violent. Next slide. So as we've talked about, a lot of my background really is in providing substance abuse treatment to the deaf community and working with a program that provided services on a national basis, sort of for the reasons Dr. Lomas talked about. We're talking about a low incidence population. And if you want to get specialized services, sometimes to have that milieu, you need to provide it in a regional, or in our case, it was provided in a national way. And a lot of the individuals I worked with, because of the illegal activities they were doing to get their drugs, ended up in various prisons, and they were not really given equal access. So generally speaking, in the general population, we know that inmates are probably 7 times more likely than individuals in the general population to have a substance use disorder. And about 80% of people arrested test positive for drugs. So even if they weren't arrested because of their drug use is involved in ultimately a number of the people in prison. Next slide. We also know that there's a higher rate of substance use and criminal justice encounters in general among people with disabilities. So if we look at SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health, the federal agency, my mind's like going blank, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Agency, that deals federally with both mental health and substance abuse services. They have done some studies, and their studies do show that there is a significantly higher rate of substance use disorders among those who are having disabilities than those who don't have disabilities. Other sources indicate that individuals with mental health diagnoses and substance use disorders are overrepresented in the justice system. Now, in terms of deaf and hard of hearing individuals, we don't have a lot of resource on how many people have both mental health and substance use issues. Now, the program that we founded back in the late 80s, we served over 1,600 deaf individuals. And one of the questions we asked throughout those years was whether or not the person had a mental health diagnosis or issue. And we found that of the 1,682 treated in the Minnesota program, all deaf and hard of hearing, 700 of them did have an additional mental health diagnosis. So that kind of fits in line with what we would see in the regular population. And it's over a third of the individuals really have an accompanying disability of mental health. So data strongly implies that people with disabilities who are at higher risk for substance use disorders are more likely to encounter the criminal justice system. Now, there's actual federal grant right now going on that's looking at individuals who have intellectual disabilities and substance use issues. And I had shared some of it with Michelle because they're looking for individuals that they can meet with or caregivers of those individuals because they're looking at this prevalence within that population. Next slide. So in terms of deaf offenders, very few studies. In fact, really, we have to go way back to 1999 to McKay Vernon to really find any studies that were done looking at deaf offenders and a connection with drug or alcohol use. So he did a study with 29 deaf murderers. He found that half of them were intoxicated at the time of the murder. Of that number, 62% reported a history of alcohol and or marijuana use, and about 35.9% were using other kinds of drugs as well. So we can only assume that this number has continued to be at that level or higher, although we don't have additional studies since that time. Next slide. So I wanted to share this message. This is an inmate that I am in regular contact with, and I told him I was going to be meeting with professionals, and what message did he want to be given? And he said, there are not enough drug programs for the deaf in the US, so it is important for professionals to know how to help deaf addicts. He is serving time in prison because of his addiction and the illegal activities he did because of that, and we'll be meeting him a little later on. Next slide. Another case. This is another juvenile. You know, in our educational system, we do a pretty good job of trying to protect and enable some of our youth from natural consequences. And there are times when, especially with substance use, natural consequences are really important for a person to realize that they have an issue. And when you're young and you're 14, you don't necessarily see the future of that use. This was probably one of the most extreme cases that I've ever worked with. This individual was 14, profoundly deaf, proficient in ASL, average or above intelligence, parents both in prison because of drug use, lived with his grandparents, and he attended a school for the deaf where he was flown weekly because of the distance he was away from the school. He used a variety of drugs and alcohol and eventually heroin, injecting it. He was fascinated with homeless people. He had been in juvenile hall at one point with no school provided. He was there for 9 or 10 months. And eventually there was a lawsuit filed against the state, which resulted in him being placed wherever they could find 24-hour-a-day service for him. And it meant out of state. So he was in a program out of state with 24-hour communication. He ran from the program, stole liquor, drank until drunk, had a number of consequences, and his vocational goal, to grow pot, and then when he turned 18, stop all drugs and only use pot. So that program closed, and there was no place for him to go. When he turned 18, because they were unsuccessful at conserving him, he was pretty much released out on the streets and continued to use, was back in California using. So our system again really failed because there were no programs to really intervene early on. And once he was put into the juvenile system, his rights were violated. There were 75 counts filed against the state, and all 75 were upheld. And to this day, he's continuing his use with inappropriate interventions and lack of services now as an adult out on the streets. Next slide, please. So moving into the work within the prison system and technology, I saw somewhere in the chat that Kentucky does have video phones for those individuals who are incarcerated and use Purple, which is a contract service provider that provides interpreter services through the video relay systems in a number of states' prison systems. I'm going to talk about some of the issues with that technology, and you'll see an example firsthand. So I'll use Texas as an example. In about 2019, Texas signed a contract for the first time to have video phone service providers, and they installed their first video phone within the prison system. Now, for some of the inmates, this was the first time they had ever seen or used a video phone, and some of them were incarcerated way before such a thing was in existence. A lot of the prisons and a lot of us grew up in the field using what's called a TTY, which looks like a little typewriter, and the phone would go on the couplers and you would type back and forth. Some would have paper that would print out. Some would just have an LED screen. So you can imagine how slow and cumbersome that kind of communication can be. Some of the prisons still only have that for their communication. We see more and more lawsuits and video phones being provided, but not all prisons still and jails have video phones. And really, more states are providing video phones because of lawsuits, and that's why it's occurring. So when the video phones are available, hearing and deaf and hard of hearing callers have to go through a registration process before access is given. So for instance, I'm in communication with, I'll use this deaf individual as an example. In order for me to be able to communicate using a video phone or relay services, I had to provide my driver's license. I had to provide my cell phone. I had to provide proof that that was my cell phone. And there was a number of other steps that needed to be taken before I could communicate. If there's ever any evidence that that individual tries to communicate with someone who is not registered, that privilege is lost. As an example, this individual was communicating with their mother, and they wanted to post a message on Facebook. That was found out. That would be considered third party because people on Facebook are not given permission to communicate with this individual. So there's a lot of stipulations that are in place if a person's going to communicate directly with someone in prison. Next slide. Now, if we continue to use an example of technology, kind of a really cool example, Texas, which I'm using as an example, houses their inmates together at the state level. So prior to COVID, there were 60 to 80 deaf inmates housed together. Now, since COVID, there's about 40 to 60 deaf inmates housed together. The two primary reasons the deaf inmates are there have to do with sexual related incidents and drug and alcohol related incidents resulting in other kinds of crimes. So this is a deaf inmate who had been in prison for over 30 years and is in his 70s. Every week, faithfully, his mother, who's in her 90s, and his older sister would come and visit. They didn't know sign language. As we learned early on, 90% of deaf individuals are born to hearing families. And in the older days like this, oftentimes families didn't know sign language. They would write back and forth. This inmate did not have good language skills. Their communication was very iffy, but he knew they were there. He knew they loved him. Well, once video phones were introduced, his family was able to get registered. And for the first time, probably in his life, he was able to communicate with his family through sign language interpreters, which was such an emotional experience for his family. So that was a positive that came out of having access to video phones. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, in Texas, inmates are housed together while being careful not to discriminate, segregate, or isolate. Now, in other states, inmates are in prisons related to the crime they committed or maybe where they live. Now, it's interesting. In one prison that I work with in California, because of gang activity, they do not house inmates together if they are deaf, because if they're in an opposing gang, that would provide potential danger or violence. So, maybe if you know of prisons in Kentucky where inmates are housed together, you could put it in the chat. I'm going to share some kind of interesting data for you later about Kentucky that I think you'll find interesting. But states do vary with how they handle this. And in Texas, the Estelle unit is what it's called in Huntsville, and that is where they are housed together. There are positives and negatives to housing inmates together. A positive might be that if you do have sign language interpreters available, they would be in one unit and not have to go travel to a large geographical area. Interesting, right now, with the 40 to 60 inmates, guess how many interpreters they have for 40 to 60 deaf inmates? One. one certified sign language interpreter, which means the priority is given to medical appointments and emergencies. If you want to take a class, if you want to go to a 12-step meeting, if you're in need of any kind of treatment, there are no sign language interpreters for you. The other thing is they have 2 video phones for 40 to 60 inmates. So when the video phones first were put in place, there were huge lines, people waiting to use the video phone. And the person I communicated with actually would go use a TTY because no one was waiting in line for the use of that video. Gabe, I'm seeing some comments. Anything pertinent, or are people just sharing information?
Well, somebody just wrote that prisons in Kentucky are housed more by classification and custody level.
Okay, great.
The inmates in Kentucky are not housed together if they're deaf.
Okay, thank you, because I was interested in that information. Next slide, please. So the incarceration experience. So it's challenging to understand prison rules and follow instructions without accommodations. I'm working with a prison in California that's under a consent decree. The majority of the individuals in their system are actually hard of hearing. And the first thing I noticed when walking into their system is you felt like you were in a cement mixer. There are no acoustic tiles. It's just this huge cement room. And it was hard for me as a hearing person to follow the conversation because of the echoing that was going on. So there's a lot of things to consider, not just situations of interpreters and sign language. In that same prison, if you were in a wheelchair, and this wasn't that long ago, you were not permitted to bring it with you because it was considered to be a weapon. So you would not have the ability to be mobile within the prison. You would have to stay in the cell because you had no way to move about without this wheelchair. And the prison was not accessible. Since then, because of lawsuits, it is much more accessible. But that was not that long ago that was occurring. And how inhumane is that? So some of the things that can be done in a prison system is to have more visual displays, not just loudspeaker systems. Right now, if it's time to take a shower and information is over a loudspeaker, a deaf person misses out. The prison system in Texas has a buddy system. So the deaf individuals are dependent on the hearing inmates to tap them and notify them or wave their hands to let them know it's time for a shower. So the individual I'm in touch with was sleeping and missed out hearing the people trying to get his attention that it was time to take a shower. So there's really a lot of work still that needs to be done on having, again, equal communication access separate from sign language interpreters. So we really need to work on how to be more creative with technology. A lot of the prisons have now gone to using tablets. And so there are some ways with tablets that there can be notifiers on there if there are certain things that are going to happen throughout the day. But prisons have a long way to go to get to that point. There's a variety of inequities that happen to deaf individuals while in prison. 4 individuals who were all in prison in another state on the East Coast for sexual related kinds of incidents. In order to get out on parole, they had to take a class and pass the class. The class was in English with no interpreters, and of the 4, only 1 was able to pass the class. The other 3 are still in prison, again, because of the lack of that kind of access. When you leave prison, often they look at the programs that you were in while in the prison system. So if you're in prison because of substance use issues and you don't participate in substance use programs while in prison, that's viewed negatively. But how can you participate if communication isn't provided? I know one individual who participated in a faith-based program for 1 year with no communication whatsoever, just so that it could be shown as a positive that he tried to be involved. And because there wasn't communication, they didn't give him the points for that participation. So again, we really need to look at what we can do to try and enhance the communication access access for programming so that deaf individuals don't stay in prison longer, so they have the same opportunity as hearing. Next slide. So this was, again, an inmate's experience not too long ago. So this deaf inmate was walking alone to the dining room, and an officer shouted at him several times, got no response, and then discovered he was deaf. The officer actually walked over to him from behind, grabbed his sweatshirt hood, and pulled it with full force, the inmate falling to the ground. The inmate recognized him as a guard who isn't always as positive and affirming with deaf individuals, and he could read his lips and said, "I know you're deaf, you're dumb to ignore my calls to you." So again, education is important for the guards as well. Now, this is an example of someone who maybe was to the extreme, and I know that not everyone in the system is like this, and there's a lot of ADA officers who are there to try and help to educate. But again, I think we need to keep in mind that a lot of people are victimized when they're in prison, no different than Michelle. You saw that she had gotten her teeth knocked out. These things do happen, unfortunately, and the lack of communication doesn't help. Next slide. So I did an informal survey. I was interested to know what does occur in different states, and are the inmates housed together or are they separate? And so I contacted Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Kentucky, and this was a few years ago, would have talked to Michelle, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, Ohio, Texas, and Virginia. And one of the states that I was impressed with was actually Ohio. Now, it was the result of a lawsuit, but they actually have 7 sign language interpreters working in the system. The interpreters are actually involved with new employee orientation with the guards. They work with the guards on how to utilize an interpreter, what's appropriate. There's also some sign language courses that are offered to other inmates by inmates, to the point that now if a deaf inmate goes to the commissary, there's actually people that can communicate with them. So it's for conversational reasons, not formal programming. So they've really come a long way. They do house their inmates together as much as they can, unless there's a reason that they aren't able to. And right now they have about 18 to 20 inmates. Now in North Carolina, and maybe you're doing some similar things in Kentucky, they have actually a committee made up of deaf services, people who work in the prison system, law enforcement, sheriff's office, all working at a state level to try and get some more standards set up for services for deaf individuals who are in the prison system. So if you're interested, or if you're working in that capacity, I can give you some context in North Carolina, because that's what they've been doing for probably 2 to 4 years now. And they did bring Being Michelle to their state as sort of a point of education for this group that's been working together for several years. Next slide. So this is something that is positive. You know, we've talked a lot about some of the negativity going on, and this is something that I wanted to share with you that is adding some more access for deaf individuals. So as I mentioned, tablets are now being used in prisons, and there's pros and cons. So if I'm in a prison system and I'm given this tablet, I can use it to watch educational videos, some recreational videos that I have to pay for. And if I'm a hearing person, I actually can use this for phone calls. Now, a negative about this tablet is, as a deaf person, I can't use this to make video phone calls. The reason is because of confidentiality and because of the camera. So if I'm in a cell and I'm talking as a hearing person, you still have confidentiality. No one can see the inmate, no one can see that conversation. For a deaf person, there's a camera. So there is concern that you could show you're in the other cellmate or people within the prison. So they have not figured out a way to conquer that. What that means is that if I'm on lockdown, I have no communication as a deaf person, and my cellmate who may be hearing does. So again, it isn't really very equitable. But going to this Edivo, years ago, when I first interacting with deaf individuals, we would have to use paper and pencil. So you would write a letter, you would send it, it would arrive at the prison. It would take maybe 2 to 4 days. They would have to screen every letter coming in and then every letter leaving. So now they've gone to more of an electronic system called JPay and Securus. And it's all done on this tablet. So when I communicate now with someone in the prison system, once I've registered and get approved, it's like writing an email. And you pay the cost of a stamp to be able to communicate back and forth. Now, this Edivo, which I told you has educational material on it, initially, nothing was in American Sign Language. And I learned about this company from, actually, it was a deaf ministry group, and they had put a Bible that was in sign language on this system. So I thought, well, if they can do that, then I should be able to do that with substance use materials, mental health lectures, other kinds of things that are out there. So I was able to work with Edivo, and I was able to get the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is in sign language, on the Edivo platform. I was able to get a program called Signs of Safety, which is in sign language and focuses on trauma and addiction. And I was able to get a series of lectures that the Counseling Center, Gallaudet University, did on Edivo. And I always put a plug in because if any of you know of lectures or materials that are out there and accessible, let me know because I would love to get it on the system. Next slide, please. So Edivo right now, if you look at what is available, these are the things I was part of. So I get statistics that I can see that tell me how many people started the particular educational item and how many completed it. So for instance, the first category all has to do with different parts of the big book, the Alcoholics Anonymous big book. 22,000 people started, 6,000 finished. And then Signs of Safety, which is, I told you, on trauma and addiction, 6,000 started, and it tells you how many finished, and then the lectures. So it also breaks down for me by state. Next slide. So I can tell you that Edivo is used in 46 states. And if you look at Kentucky, 19 facilities in Kentucky use Edivo. So there's a question about that. And last night, I actually thought, I wonder if I could go on here and actually tell you how many people access it and at which facilities. Next slide. So here are the 19 facilities, and here are the individuals at each one that is actually using this. So you can see that at one of the facilities, there were 50 people that started, and then it tells you again who completed it. Now, you all are probably more familiar with these, but it was the Luther Luckett Correctional Complex that had 50 people start using the 12-step material. And you can see that there was about 19 that completed it. So I think this is really good for you to see that a lot of people are using this information. So I see that's where I worked. Someone said they worked somewhere. So it looks like there must be a larger population of deaf inmates, maybe in some of these prisons, if that number of people was accessing the material. Now, I can't say that only deaf people who use ASL access the material. It doesn't tell me that. It just tells me who started and who completed. But I was pretty excited to see this. And there's 19 different facilities, which matches where, Edivo indicates that they have gone into. Next slide. I was thrilled, though. Hopefully you are too, to see that. So one of the things I just wanted to mention was, again, communication with this deaf inmate. He was released during COVID for good behavior, and he ended up not being able to find any services in Texas. There were none, and they did not want to give him approval to leave state. There is a program in Atlanta, and by the time he finally got approval, which was months and months later, he reoffended and he's back in prison serving another 15 years. So again, the system really failed him, and he returned to prison. Next slide. So just the communication impact that, as we've talked about, people either when they get out of prison, they end up back in the system. And a lot of it has to do with not having equal access while they're not being able to participate in programs. Next slide. So I'm going to introduce you to Rennie. And Rennie knows that we're going to be looking at a few examples of him. He is actually from a deaf family. He's very articulate, bright guy, started college at different times in his life. And he's been in prison at least 3 or 4 times. He is in the Estelle unit, which is about an hour and a half north of Houston, 3.5 hours from Austin, where the School for the Deaf is. Next slide. Rennie was arrested back in 2011. I kind of break this down for robbery by assault. One of the times that he was arrested, he went into a nonprofit housing office, asked for water by writing a note, and then grabbed money from the desk and car keys, leading to a struggle, and drove off with this person's car while they're hanging on, trying to keep the car. Again, he's been sentenced. It always comes back to his crack cocaine addiction. The illegal activities that he does is really because of that. So he's currently serving another 15 years in prison, 4th time incarcerated. Next slide. So I've kind of gone through this already, so I'm not going to spend time doing it. Just to let you know that, again, Rennie is very fluent in English and American Sign Language. And so for him, he can write to me, and it's very intelligible in English using JPay, where some of the other inmates really are illiterate and not able to do that. So he's able to communicate and get his needs met that way. But the problem is with the video phone. The reception is horrible. And I have an example I'm going to show you. So although these prisons put video phones in place, the bandwidth is bad. And so if you're dependent on sign language, just like we're seeing now, you need to have clarity. There is not clarity. So let's go to the next slide and see this example. So, and I think we can stop it. He's basically talking about that there's no air conditioning, but if you were trying to be dependent on watching this, you wouldn't. It's blurry, it's pixelating, and this is typically what happens. So if a person is using an interpreter or trying to communicate directly, that's not the same communication that a hearing person has. Next slide. One of the things that Rennie got involved in at the prison was a life skills program. They had a volunteer interpreter for the class and did their best to get through it. But it was a life-changing experience for Rennie. And they posted it, the prison did, on Instagram. They showed the different deaf inmates getting their certificates. And I have a few pictures, next slide, that show some of the inmates as they graduated from this 6-month life skills program. And you can see in the bottom right, Rennie and another inmate with their certificates being very proud. And in fact, now Rennie is actually being trained to assist with the life skills class when it's taught the next time around, which is pretty cool. Next slide. Is this the example with Rennie? I think we're going to show you, I asked Rennie what he would recommend for deaf professionals, hearing professionals, and the community. And we're just going to show a minute or two of this, and then I'll summarize it for you. It is not captioned. The interpreters are going to have to voice it. And if it's too challenging to do, I've summarized the key points. I can't hear you. You're muted.
My apologies. So Deb asked a question. Please tell me what I should let the interpreters or other people in the community know. about working with this population. And he's saying, yes, when the interpreter arrives, I know that, they arrive, hopefully they have certification from BEI or RID. And some of them here are literate. Some people here are not literate. So you have to kind of watch and make sure, are they understanding what you're saying or not understanding what you're signing? And if it's not, then you might need to get to the right people who can understand this person's communication and understand what he's talking about. Because, for example, this one guy got an 80-year sentence, basically life, but the interpreter was too prideful to say, no, I didn't understand this, or ask for clarification or anything. And so this guy is like, why did I get 80 years? And it all goes back to the interpreter. Also, with people who the hearing impaired council, we have to make sure that we have good interpreters. Honestly, that's my advice. Make sure that you are understanding what that individual is using as language. If you can't understand it, bring in a CDI to make sure that it's understood so that communication is happening. I would also say,
Yeah, I was going to say we can pause it and I'll just summarize the next thing he says just for time. But I think sometimes hearing this directly from an inmate is the most sense. And he's saying what we've been saying all along. So just in summary, that many of the deaf inmates have language deprivation and may be illiterate. So if the interpreter misunderstands, such as the example he gave, it could mean more time in prison for that deaf inmate. So again, it's really important, if communication isn't clear, to use a certified deaf interpreter. The second point he made, which I thought was interesting, deaf inmates want to have more volunteers come to the prison. He's saying whether the volunteers are hearing or deaf, with the ability to sign, that's what they're wanting. The thought is that having more volunteers come into the prison gives more presence and helps with more education for the wardens and other staff. His point was that the hearing programs have all these volunteers, but because there isn't a strong or large deaf community where the prison is located, it's challenging and difficult to have people come in to visit at all and to give the program a voice. So I thought that was really interesting that that was a strong recommendation. Next slide. I mentioned a bit about the consent decree that is a result of a lawsuit in California. California's been under consent decree actually for a number of years. And some of the issues, again, really have to do with prisons are located sometimes in more rural areas. So even if there's well-intentioned individuals to try and fulfill the needs with communication access, it's a hard population to generate interpreters for. There's fear going into a prison setting. The location isn't where a lot of interpreters reside. And so it doesn't assist with having full access. So part of what this prison is doing, and it's a county jail, and they have over 1,000 individuals in this system, is they have increased their officers, their ADA officers, so that they are really trying to work with all disability groups. And then my role has been in assisting what they can do to have more access, better access for hard of hearing and deaf individuals when they come into the system and then throughout their stay. And we meet regularly in order to do that, to try and come up with troubleshooting and problem solving. Next slide. I'm not going to take the time at all to go through this, but this is an individual, so you can advance it 2 slides. This is an individual who was incarcerated in Florida, let's go through this one too to litigation. Incarcerated in Florida, North Carolina, Georgia. And he talks about how there is this assumption that anyone in prison is violent and this fear. And it really impacts the access that the inmates have. And he talked about the differences of one state prison system to another. And he was heavily involved in gang activity. So when he was in prison in Florida, he was watched out for because members of his gang were there. Whereas when he was in prison in Georgia, he wasn't watched out for. He wasn't involved in gang activity anymore. And oftentimes, because of his deafness, consequences occurred if he wasn't aware of things going on around him. At another time, maybe I can share with you some of the excerpts from that. In closing, I'm going to talk about a few of the cases with litigation that are current, and then Gabe's going to give some final recommendations. One of the more recent cases had to do with one in Tennessee. Now, you'll see there's similar themes with all of these cases. Basically, a result of this is that hearing tests would be provided every 3 years if an individual is over 65. So that's getting more at that geriatric hearing loss. Video phones would be provided, interpreters and other accommodations. And then there were some damages paid. So this one just was in March. Next slide. Prior to that, there had been one in Wisconsin. Next slide. And that was in September in 2024. And again, similar. But one of the things that's a little different here, they focus on visual notification systems and hearing aids, communication assessment. So when a person comes in, they're going to try and determine what mode of communication best meets the need of that inmate. Roger Williams, who I saw in the chat that Michelle had alluded to, developed a communication assessment system with Charlene Crump that is something that is highly recommended and used. So the fact that they're at least going to be doing this is a positive. Next slide. More and more prisons have the video phones because of litigation with the FCC. And it has to do with if you have 50 or more inmates, sort of the stipulations that need to happen, contracting with a company to have access for video phones. Another case that was interesting, next slide, is this Georgia case, which really focused on what happened after people left prison. This individual that was named in this case, next slide, and this was a civil rights case, he would show up for his probation or parole appointment with no interpreter. And they said, well, you're supposed to provide the interpreter, we don't. And he didn't know when he was supposed to be showing up. And oftentimes people could end up back in prison because of that. So there was a case that was filed. And now things have changed in Georgia. So the civil rights case was won, and things are improving with the work that goes on when a person leaves prison and the community supervision. Next slide. And this was just a quote from the plaintiff, how they expected him to follow rules that they didn't explain to him. And he had to sign these forms that he didn't understand. And then later, he found out that one of the forms waived his rights. So again, the need for communication. And it's not the deaf person's responsibility to go to a probation officer for an appointment and provide their own interpreter. Next slide. This is a case that is going on and on and on and on and on and on in California. And they just found that they were not satisfactorily meeting the requirements, and it started years ago. So it's still ongoing. Next slide. Next slide. Just more about that case. And then next slide, I did include the case that you all had that has been no longer being monitored. And I know that Michelle did a presentation where she talked in depth about it. So this one, people satisfied what was required, and hopefully that has helped within your system to have better access. And then I think now the remaining minutes, Gabe's going to do some closing and recommendations.
Well, keep your mic on, Dr. Guthman. We can do it together. So I think some of this is low-hanging fruit, things that you guys will have come to your own conclusions, but clearly effective communication has to be the priority. When a deaf or hard of hearing person's arrested, that handcuffing in the front of the body is an accommodation that could allow them to use some sign language or to be able to write. It's not required for they handcuff in the back unless they feel like if there's any threats to their safety. Establish preliminary communication to advise the suspect the reason for the arrest and determine the need for communication auxiliary aid. So just making sure that they understand what's going on. Certified interpreter should be present, and then those with poor English skills should have a CDI, a certified deaf interpreter. And that kind of goes back to the assessment piece that we need to be evaluating their functioning, including their English and their language skills to make sure that we are getting them the proper accommodations. Now, a lot of times we want to have multiple interpreters. So typically during the trial, the interpreter should be made available to the defense so that the deaf defendant and the defense lawyer can interact with one another privately. I think that's typically called a table interpreter. So that's just dedicated to those people who are working on the defense. And then some deaf defendants who've lost their hearing later in life have really do have good reading skills and may prefer captioning instead of a sign language interpreter. So making sure that we know what kind of accommodations that they require is important. And during an interrogation, it should be videotaped and audio taped. And, both Dr. Guthman and I have a lot of experience with this, reviewing these. You can see in that, the one that we showed you today, that there was not an interpreter there. But if there should be an interpreter when the person requests it, and the interpreter should be included in the video so that experts can verify that the interpreting matches and that the interpreter matches the functioning abilities of the deaf person. Using a videotape with a deaf person is pretty much the legal equivalent of using audio tape with a hearing person, and we see that audio is always required. In incarceration, video displayed announcements, like we're seeing this a lot. There needs to be retrofitting so that deaf people can look at the announcements and they can read them, or having visual announcements of some sort versus having audio announcements where they miss out on what's going on around them. Now, in general, housing deaf inmates together can be helpful, but we have to remember that some deaf inmates it can be dangerous housing some deaf inmates that have more significant crimes with those who have less serious crimes. So when possible, the deaf inmates should be together so that they can have access to communication with each other and have a peer group. When possible, inmates using sign language should be housed near cities where there are interpreter populations so that we can have access to interpreters. And video phones would be the equivalent of having a phone used for hearing people, so we want to have video phones available as well. Also related to incarceration, interpreters should be available for classes, parole hearings, 12-step meetings, substance abuse treatment, and so on. Anything that's available to the hearing population should be available to the deaf population with interpreters. And prisons should use appropriately trained healthcare professionals to screen, assess, and treat offenders. Making sure that we have the right people is important, and communication assessment should be done with all inmates and then periodically reevaluated. So when people when inmates are taken in during their intake period, we should be having the healthcare professional identify what's going on with them. Do they have a healthcare condition? Do they have disabilities? And we should document that and then periodically reevaluate to see, like, has there been any decline in hearing ability? And members of the deaf community should be utilized to train people who work in prison settings. Then we can't forget that after prison, people get released, and we need to make sure that we have supports there as well. So deaf people should be connected with the VR system to find employment, because employment is critical to recovery and reducing recidivism. States should ensure that transitional programs are available for deaf people, including access to halfway houses, parole officers, treatment providers, and so on. I mean, that is a big piece of, like, prevention of people going back to prison, and having these programs is really vital for recidivism. Well, there are some resources, and it's a lovely slide there. Any questions? We're at the end now, and just about at the end of our time. Dr. Guthman, I don't know if you noticed there may have been some questions in the chat. I hope we got to them.
Yeah, it looks like more comments from what I'm seeing. Michelle, did you have any comments or closing thoughts?
This is Michelle. I am so thrilled with all of the information that you presented, and it gives us all a lot to think about. No matter where we are within the system, we can all be working harder and working together to figure out how to increase the communication access. please know that all of the slides will go out to everyone, and we welcome continued conversation. We obviously could have talked about this for a week versus 3 hours. I thank you so much for your expertise, Dr. Lomas and Dr. Guthman. Thank you to our interpreters, to Shannon and Julie, and thank you to our captioner, Tracy, as well. I also want to thank Lee Taylor for doing an amazing job of getting all the technology set up. So I am grateful to all of us and all of you doing the work out in the field. And I hope that we can continue thinking about how we can make things better for people with hearing loss and serious mental illness in the criminal justice system in Kentucky. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.
Bye.